I'm John Harle. I'm the Director of Programmes for INASP, based in Oxford, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for making the time today. I think for some people it's probably morning coffee, others it might be middle of your lunch, and some, certainly Chalani, it's stretching the working day into the evening, so we're very grateful that you've made the time for that. I will introduce now our three panelists who all generously made the time in very busy schedules to join a conversation today. They are Dr. Maha, who is an Associate Professor of Practice at the Center for Learning and Teaching at the American University in Cairo. Maha has co-founded and facilitates a number of initiatives on inclusive digital learning, edits a number of journals in this space. Then we have Dr. Joy Kiiru, who is the Deputy Board Chair and Chair for the Higher Education and Research Committees at the Mawaso Institute in Nairobi, and is also a Senior Lecturer at the University of Nairobi's School of Economics, and where her research covers women's empowerment, inclusive finance, and impact evaluations. And thirdly, we have Chalani Ranwala, who heads the communication team at Verité Research, Verité perhaps, in Sri Lanka, and she's got lots of experience in building and implementing communication campaigns on a whole range of policy issues in the think tank space. I've seen some familiar names in the room already, which is great, as well as lots of new people who I've certainly not met yet. So I'm looking forward to your comments and your insights. So please do add those to the chat as we go, and any questions you have. Our aim is that the panel will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll break to give you a chance to ask your questions and to make your comments, and then we'll give the panel an opportunity to respond to those and see where we go. And so just before I hand over to the speakers, I just wanted to say a few words to kind of frame the session and say what it is that we thought was interesting to talk about here. So we've called the session Cracks in the Knowledge System, and it departs from an observation that in the last 9 months or so, our attention has been drawn to lots of processes of exclusion that run throughout knowledge systems. So the way we produce and we communicate and we use knowledge in all its different forms. That they're not new problems, they've been with us for a long time, but the pandemic has certainly been a prompt to think about them and how we address them and what more we have to do, and with some greater urgency perhaps. And so our starting point is that the best way to create knowledge that serves the needs of communities and societies, wherever they are, is to make the process of producing and using that knowledge much more inclusive. And if we don't, then the body of knowledge that we generate is likely to be a lot less valuable, because it will neglect experiences and needs and perspectives and insights of a great many people. What does that mean? There are some obvious things that we observe day to day, issues to do with infrastructure, who have access to digital tools and connections and can study and work, and can participate in the kind of discussion that we're going to have today. We see lots of inequities between individuals, between institutions, and between countries. So where you are and who you are and the languages you speak and the support you can access helps or hinders you. But there are also, I think, some deeper and perhaps less visible questions, and those are about whose ideas and knowledge really counts, whose knowledge is valued, how is that legitimized by methodologies and practices that come to be accepted as normative in a global system of knowledge, and how they translated into the tools by which we make assessments for what gets funded, what gets published, and what is valued ultimately. And just a final reflection, I think that it's very easy to agree that equity matters, and but that's often followed by kind of a but, and that but is sometimes phrased something along the lines of, yes, of course, equity is really important, but we obviously need to make sure we maintain quality and rigor, and that means doing things in a a certain way, and standards are standards, and so yes, we need training and mentoring, and that seems to me to place equity and excellence on opposite sides of the spectrum. And that means that excellence is being decided by those who have the power, and in that way they are controlling the way knowledge is produced. In INASP, we focus on the capacities to produce and communicate and use knowledge, and we understand that as a process of change. And while that's often presented in very technical terms, we see it as fundamentally about power, and that means we have to be prepared to disturb the symmetries in power and to be aware of and change our own role too. And for us, an important part of that is to listen and learn from others, which is what we hope to do in this session. So without further ado, now I want to hand over to the speakers so we can do that. We can listen to them and hear their insights. So I want to start by just asking each of them in turn to think about what they've observed in recent months about exclusion, about inclusion, positive and negative, and to offer some observations to us. So Maha, if we could start with you, what have you seen in the last few months?
All right. Thank you for having this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to listening to Chalani and Joy as well. So in the last few months, I think what we've observed is some inequalities being exacerbated and then some sort of being decreased, right? So for example, one very obvious one is all the conferences going online, so many of them being free, meaning everyone who has an internet connection and time at home, obviously, because mothers who have lots of children probably don't have that time, even if they have the connection, are able to access certain kinds of knowledge that beforehand were pretty much inaccessible to us. My maximum was going to like 1 or 2 conferences a year. That was all I could afford. Now I can be like at 3 conferences on the same day sometimes, and that's one thing. Although I would say maybe a lot of them are still coming from the global north. A few are coming out of the global south as well. And that means that knowledge coming from the global south is also more accessible to the north if they want to listen. And that's a big if, of course. And then in other ways, I think I like to use Nancy Fraser's model of social justice when looking at anything, and we can see what's happening there. So for example, she talks about the economic, the cultural, and the political aspects of social justice. You talked a lot about power and who has the power to decide the things like the formats of things like how technologies can change the ways we interact with each other by giving power to one person to mute other people, or power to one person to be the only one who can give power to people to chat. Like, when you're in a Zoom webinar and the chat is turned off, you have no way to talk to participants. Whereas if you were in real life, you could still whisper to the person next to you. And that you can't do that. So platforms are both limiting what we can do and also at the same time empowering us and liberating us to do other things. Everything being online means that governments for whom surveillance is a thing are now having a field day probably, because they can monitor so much more than they could before, because everything is happening that way. So that's something to keep in mind. And so going back to Nancy Fraser's model, I think John already talked about the power and the politics of knowledge in general. It's like who's deciding who gets invited to speak in spaces like these, and what decisions do they make about whose voice gets into the main stage or into plenary sessions versus into breakouts. But also, I think one of the things is because everyone, or in most countries, people have to start to learn online, people start to think, oh, well, this is a good day for open resources, right? But most of these open resources are in particular languages from particular points of view. And so if we don't have the time to create our own resources, or if we don't have the funding to create our own resources, we're having to reuse knowledge coming again from the West in English, and then trying to figure out what to do. So I'm going to stop here, I think, but I want to say that in terms of the economic aspect and access, we need to think it's not just access to the digital infrastructure and devices, also how well it's divided inside a home, but also access to the language of technology and to digital literacies, that how much digital literacies did learners, teachers, and institutions have. So not just how much each teacher has, but how much digital systems did an institution have as an infrastructure beforehand, so that when you had to do a lot of things online, how ready were you to do that? And I'm going to leave it to the rest of our panelists, and I'll come back and talk about other things later.
Thanks very much, Maha. That's a great start. Chalani, can I hand over to you and get your thoughts? What have you seen, good or bad, that reflect these inequities in the system?
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for having me here. Just taking off what Maha was saying earlier about increasing access, I was just noting down sort of two main areas in which I saw sort of going digital, actually increasing access to things that weren't available before. One such example from my own personal experience of planning events which are meant to be inclusive, it became a lot more possible, especially through online mediums such as Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and this platform. There are so many others. And I work at a think tank where we host events quite regularly, and the sort of intention is to get a wide variety of different people from different backgrounds. Just taking it from an example of something we did this year, we were able to actually host a small group of parliamentarians on a call like this on Zoom and sort of stream it live on Facebook. And we did get like hundreds of people joining in, and the purpose was for parliamentarians to debate the best response Sri Lanka can take in dealing with the COVID-19 situation, which they couldn't physically do inside Parliament because we were under curfew and we couldn't move around. So in terms of access to that kind of conversation, which couldn't have happened if we had sort of a, let's say, an event, a physical event in an auditorium somewhere, we may have had 30 people and not more. So I think really the sort of moving conversations and debates like this onto digital platforms has definitely opened the way for more inclusion at a much lower cost as well. I mean, it costs nothing to get an additional person or 10 people or 100 people onto a platform like this. And another thing that a positive sort of experience I noted in terms of the information access gap widening, the information sort of access to information widening is how many things sort of became free that were previously not. So things like apps became free, education, certification courses became free, and a lot of students and people were taking advantage of this free access to knowledge, particularly, which they didn't have before. So that's another sort of, in hindsight, something that I realized that this new normal kind of created more access to knowledge than there was before. On the flip side, something that I wanted to bring up because something I noticed and experienced quite recently in terms of there being a gap in access to information during this time was actually with regards to something we observed in how the government was providing regulations on health regulations on COVID-19. And what we realized was that there was no sort of separate guidelines issued for people with disabilities in the country. And that was a huge, serious gap that we noticed. And through our research, we were able to highlight that gap and show that countries such as India have actually included persons with disabilities into their health regulations during this pandemic. And that is a huge gap. And I'm sure other countries are also maybe facing that difficulty in terms of this is sort of a situation in which information on how to react, how to sort of access medicine, access information, access testing needs to be available widely for so many different types of communities who obviously sort of consume information in different ways and are not always able to read and write and watch the news. So that is a significant gap I noticed recently through my own experience in doing research. But yes, I think we can all admit that there are two sides to this story of sort of access to knowledge during this time. I'll stop there, but I look forward to hearing from Joy and from everyone who's joined in the session as well.
Thanks very much, Chalani. Joy, over to you. What have you seen in Nairobi or in your digital excursions from Nairobi?
Thank you very much. I think this is a nice session because you see the problems that we are talking about. It's free, yet not very free. It's free for all to get included, but the exclusions are really manifesting themselves. You see, a couple of months before, we knew that we are all unequal. In my mother tongue, we comforted ourselves by saying that all of us are like these fingers. They are never equal. They are never the same, and it's no big deal. That's how it's supposed to be, and life goes on. But now we know that those inequalities are really such big deals, especially the last couple of months. Yes, not all of us have access to technology. So not all of us are able to do online classes, which is really a big deal here. A lot of students, like for example, in my class, I've never achieved 2/3 attendance, and it's online. It's supposed to be free, but it's not free. There's need to buy gadgets. There's need to have the technical know-how. You've just seen how much I struggled to get into this thing that just needs to click, but it was such a big deal for me. You need to know which button to click, if at all you're able to overcome all these other things. And not everybody has that, especially where I live. So these inequalities now, which we thought and we took for granted, they're becoming a matter of life and death, so to say. Imagine if I was not able to log in for whatever reasons today, I would be left behind for good. And this is something I can never recover, even in 100 years. So the last couple of years, we've just known that these inequalities in access, which we took for granted, have got now much more consequences, especially for those who things are not working there, for those who are disabled, so to say. Those who are disabled, the people will be left back and left behind, and it will take a couple of years, if at all not even a couple, dozens of years to recover, and some of the damage may never be redone. So that is something that we need to come up with. So the point is, people have talked about the good things about this technology, the inclusion side of the way it has become cheaper and all that. So I'll not go into that because I agree with all that. But I also want to bring out one blessing in disguise. There's always something good that comes out here. You see, everybody is reacting to the current pandemic or to the current realities in their own abilities. Countries are putting their muscles together to react. And scientists are out there looking for evidence to inform their policies and to tell them this is what works, this is what does not work. And last week, I think it was last week, I was on primetime news, and the anchor asked me, so now they are doing a second, they are going for more restrictions in Europe because of a second wave in COVID-19. And the president is speaking tomorrow, and our COVID case is becoming more and more serious. The deaths are rising. Should we also do the same? I'm like, we are not Europe, and we cannot do what they are doing, because if it works for them, well and good for them. But for us, if you put more restrictions, like we had before, we almost saw the country go into chaos. We saw insecurity rising. We saw inability to give social protection. We saw inability to cushion people's jobs. We saw a lot of suffering. It was sure that you die of hunger before you died of COVID. Can we find ways that work for us as a country? So in other words, now the blessing in disguise is that we cannot, and it is very, very clear, we cannot rely on knowledge created by other countries because we are not them and they cannot be like us. So this is something that we need to know. And then now it comes a point now, how do we create this knowledge? So the point becomes very clear, whatever we do, because the point is whoever puts the money controls the agenda. So and that is really becoming a good reality and a good realization. And from where I sit, that's a good starting point to start understanding what is it that we need to do to be consumers and value our own knowledge, not because it is fashionable, it's a cool thing to do, but because that is where our survival lies as a country and as a continent, for this matter. So let me just stop there saying that yes, the exclusion has got good and its bad side, that the consequences are more dire than before, and countries need to find ways of mitigating these things or dealing with these situations using their own knowledge and things that really work for them. If you try to copy like we've always done, it's not going to work this time. And the problem is nobody's going to help anybody because everybody's just suffering through this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joy. The kind of comments so far prompted a few thoughts. I want to just put a question to each of you. Maha, and what I'd like to do particularly is to think, what can we do practically? What are the small or large things we can do? So you mentioned some of the ways in which our digital infrastructure and our access and our skills have been really thrown into sharp relief here. What can we do to make learning and knowledge production in a more, not entirely, but a more digital world, more inclusive and more equitable? And perhaps there are small things we can do. You're just on mute still.
Always the most common phrase in the pandemic. So this is going to sound incoherent, even though I've prepared for it, but so I'm going to try to make it as coherent as possible. I just want to say two things at the beginning to sort of explain why this will sound a little bit incoherent. I work at the American University in Cairo, where the majority of people have good connectivity and we have very good infrastructure. And the move to online was relatively, not easy, but relatively straightforward because we already had the learning management system. We have a lot of the technology. We have the money to buy things like a big Zoom license right away and things like that. At the same time, other institutions in Egypt that are not private, that are not funded in this way, that are publicly funded, were chaos. And each school did something different, each university did something different. And my husband, who is a professor at Cairo University, he's a medical doctor and a professor there. They just bought Blackboards as a learning management system last week or last month. And he comes to me and he's like, what is this Blackboard thing? It's not a matter of you have a system and you need to add your courses to it. They have no idea what it means to have a learning management system and to manage your learning in that way. And they don't have the offline systems that map onto online systems. And they don't have the other online systems to support the learning system that's online, because it's not about just moving the learning online. There's so much that you have to do that works together. And I'm also the mother of a child who's had to learn online in a school that was not prepared to teach online before. And now whenever there are COVID cases, they close, then they go back and so on. So I think one of the first things is I think people tend to go directly to the tools and say, okay, which tool am I going to use? And they start using it. And they don't think about what is it that we're trying to do? What are the priorities that we need to teach people? And what are the values that we have based upon which we're going to choose which tools to do? Where are the teachers so that we can get them there? Someone somewhere at the top, again, whoever has power, has been making choices and not seeing if this is the most appropriate thing, if it's the same thing that will work for teaching languages as it will work for teaching architecture and engineering, and that kind of decision. Also, a lot of people have been making decisions about how to pass on content knowledge. And content knowledge is really not the only thing. That's doable. You can send it on CD. You can send it in a textbook. You don't need even online for that. But they're not thinking so much about both the social needs of learners, social learning needs, but also social emotional needs. In a time of a pandemic where there's a lot of stress and a lot of this inequality and people losing jobs sometimes because of it, and all of the trauma of possibly having someone in their family with COVID, even if none of that is happening and everyone is privileged and everyone's happy, even then, people who are not used to learning online, they don't have the digital literacies, they don't know how to manage their time, they don't know how to manage the cognitive load, and this is both the teachers and the students. And so people tend to focus on the tools and making sure that the teachers know how to click which button, which of course you need to do, but there's so much more to that about how to plan for something like that. And in order to be equitable in planning it, you need to first make sure that there's equity in the way that you treat the teachers who are going to be delivering that learning, and that institutions that are responsible for training and supporting those teachers offer them enough support to help them offer the best thing for their students. Otherwise, everyone gets frustrated. And then a lot of times the students get frustrated and the institutions blame the teachers who are not themselves supported to be able to do that. And I also want to say that this kind of thing is contextual. What is equitable in a certain situation might be different. So a lot of times, for example, University of Cape Town in South Africa, we're suggesting that everything be asynchronous to make sure that all learners have access. And this is also what we recommended at our institution at first, because the internet connectivity in Egypt doesn't hold up. I said, what if someone has 3 people at home learning at the same time? Even if the connectivity was good, with 3 people at the same time, it's not going to work. But something happened in Egypt and they improved the infrastructure overnight, which we're thinking like, why wasn't it like that from the beginning if you can do it? And then the connectivity was better, but people's socio-emotional needs were such that they wanted synchronous learning because their cognitive abilities were not enabling them to manage their time with asynchronous. And the same for the teachers. If you ask teachers to do asynchronous, this takes up a lot more time and effort from the teachers to be able to do it. So I think one of the key things is also to be flexible about what we thought was equitable was asynchronous, and we discovered that in our context, actually, synchronous was more equitable because it was taking up less effort from everyone. So it was unexpected. I've been in the field of e-learning for 20 years. That was the first time I ever come to that conclusion. And so I think that's also one of those things to keep in mind. The other one is just one quick one that happened in Egypt with students in schools, is that when the move to the pandemic happened, one of the things they said is, oh, well, instead of exams, which are really complicated to give online, as we all know, we're going to do projects instead, which sounded like such a great idea. What, this is even better. I wish they had done this before. But neither the teachers nor the students had ever done research before. They don't know how to do research. We have a system in Egypt called the Egyptian Knowledge Bank, which gets a lot of usually paywalled stuff available to everyone, which is equitable. It's horrible to research on it. It's very difficult to find anything on it. Not because we're bad researchers, because it's just not a very good system. It's very slow because everyone was using it. So things that appear on the surface to be good ideas pedagogically or appear to be equitable, you have to look at them at the practice level and who is going to do this and how well equipped are they and how well does that system achieve the purpose it claims to have. I hope this helped. I hope I didn't go too off topic with too many examples.
That's perfect. Thanks very much, Maha. That's exactly the kind of insights we need, I think, to bring it down a level to how people experience it day to day. Chalani, let me turn to you now. You mentioned in your kind of opening comments about the differential access to information. People have ability to receive and consume information, and you mentioned at some point in one of our conversations the issue of language being important and how that informs things. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how we might overcome the barriers of language.
Yes, John, so I think the situation or sort of the story of language as a barrier in Sri Lanka is very unique when compared to, I think, other countries, and especially other Asian countries. So Sri Lanka is a trilingual country. We speak Sinhala, Tamil, and English. But something that I have faced as someone who works in a think tank and is sort of in charge of the dissemination of knowledge and research is that much of the sort of academic knowledge and research disseminated, especially from a city like Colombo, is in English. And that sort of shows a huge restriction in terms of our ability to reach different communities. And another sort of very significant observation that I need to share here is that in Sri Lanka, depending on the language through which you consume information, you actually experience a different world, a whole different world. So there are gaps in the way the media report certain issues when it comes to Sinhala media or Tamil media and English media. So that is a significant barrier to access to the same kind of research that we want to put out. So what does this mean for people like us, for people who are sort of in the business of disseminating knowledge, especially in think tanks, as well as international organizations that may be sort of disseminating information in one language? It might not be English, it might be French, Spanish, and any other sort of dominant language, widely spoken language. And of course, the point of what we are doing is to have sustainable impact, to reach as many people as possible. And our impact will ultimately depend on how much we can influence public opinion. So in influencing public opinion, that's where the language barrier comes into place. So this is something that I, as sort of a communications professional, has faced sort of for many years, and we have only just come to understand what we need to do and what measures we need to take. So if I am to think of sort of 3 ways to overcome this solution, to make sure that knowledge research is accessible equally across languages, We have to, first of all, make an active effort to disseminate knowledge in local languages. It doesn't matter if the research is produced or thought of or written in a specific language. It has to be then adapted and disseminated in other local languages as well. Secondly, when it comes to making information accessible in multiple languages, I have to say that this isn't only a matter of translation. So translation is one thing, but when you actually understand the nuances of the language, in how framing takes place in different languages, and whether that sort of language is, whether we are explaining something in a way that is meaningful in a community. I don't know, maybe some of my colleagues here can relate to it, but when you live in a multilingual society, sort of the way you consume information is very different, is very sort of, the nuances and the idioms and everything used in that language is very unique. So it's not just a matter of taking English information and translating it into English. That's what my experience has been. You have to kind of think what is the best way to frame an issue or to frame a solution to an issue in that language in a way that people are able to consume it. And finally, something that I would recommend to any organization facing an issue like this would be to invest in resources and to have sort of consciously have communication strategies that are unique to different languages and not just in English. So in my experience of building and running communications campaigns, social media campaigns has predominantly been in English. And the more I did it, I was able to see limitations in how that sort of, I kept hitting a wall in terms of the audience I was reaching. I couldn't reach sort of beyond urban areas and sort of the city folk, and it was a huge barrier in terms of especially talking about social issues and policy issues that need to kind of be widely understood by the general population. So I would say definitely be intentional about having resources that are able to communicate in multiple languages, integrate bilingual or multilingual communication into communication strategies within an organization, and also make sure that your knowledge, when sharing knowledge, is packaged in a way that many people can consume, not just sort of one population that is exposed, one community that's exposed to sort of ideas and ideology in English or any other dominant language, but that it's packaged in a way that it is relatable to other people as well. So I think I'll stop there, but I think I would love to hear about any similar experiences from some of the other countries as well, because this is an area in communication that I'm quite passionate about as well.
Thanks very much, Chalani. And I really like that example you just gave of being kind of trapped in a kind of very urban sort of city community as well in much of our conversations. We need to get beyond those. Joy, over to you. So you drew attention earlier on to some of the exclusions people experience based on their background, who they are, where they are. What might be some of the practical things we could do to try and diminish those exclusions and increase access in whatever form that access is and participation?
Thank you very much. Everybody has their own biases. I have mine, you have yours. And globally, there are biases about people, about women, about race, about continents, and all that. And unfortunately, these biases can actually limit an individual beyond what they are capable of. As in, you find people are performing below their potential, not because they cannot, but the perceptions and the systems they're operating in keep dictating to them who or what they should be and do at any particular time. Like, for example, you find that there's this kind of mentality that the West will build capacity in the South, that the West will train and bring innovation and knowledge to the South. Now, if the world perceives you as a consumer of knowledge, as a project to be worked on, then the roles you'll be given will determine how you come out. If you're only given a broker role, you know, brokers just link things up and they leave the scene. If you're only given at some kind of a very small roles because of what you are perceived of your capabilities, you will have no opportunity to stand out there and work at your potential. And this is very, very true, especially in the higher institution, in the higher academic world where I work. A lot of research, like 43% of all research in developing countries is funded from outside. And the point is, when the research is funded, somebody wants to dictate what is quality, what is the agenda. And the funny bit is that everybody wants to resolve problems in developing countries, and they don't even know the context, and they don't even appreciate that the knowledge that the people down there really knows how to resolve their own problems. So at the end of the day, you find that all this thing becomes very inefficient because of all these biases in the system, biases and perceptions of people about others. So what exactly am I saying? That when we talk about resolving inequalities and coming to inclusion and embracing diversity, it's not because, oh, poor Africans, oh, poor women, you have to do something to help them. No, we must first and foremost value what is it that we get out of a more diverse workforce. There's a lot of literature. If you just ask Mr. Google, Mr. or Miss Google, I'm sure he or she is your friend. If you just asked him, what is the role of diversity in the workplace? He or she will tell you that diversity in the workplace increases innovations, improves productivity, enriches the workplace, and makes the workplaces a better place. So inclusion in the workplace and diversity in the workplace is good for its own good, and good for us is good for everybody. It's not just about the blacks or the women or the whoever else you think deserves to be marginalized because they look like they should be. It's good for us. So first and foremost, step number one, understand, educate yourself about diversity and what changes and what transformations it can bring in the workforce. Step number two, understand that by embracing diversity, by valuing, by wanting to listen, by wanting to understand other people's knowledge, can help resolve complex problems. People have said that, I remember early in March or in February, I read some very scaring reports about the predictions of COVID in Africa. And in Kenya in particular, the projections were like in a span of 1 month between March and April, we're going to see 5,000 deaths. That was a lot. Others say that we are going to be finding bodies lying on the streets because our healthcare systems will never cope. Our healthcare systems will be overwhelmed. It's just going to be a disaster. 7 months down the line, we are still holding still. And now if you ask Google about the perceptions by the scientists about Africa and COVID, he or she will tell you that actually we have surprised them. Please ask, it's not magic. It's not luck. It's what we know works for us, given our strengths and weaknesses. If you go to every home, so we've gone back to what our forefathers always taught us, that herbs and spices and activity helps the body strong. And that is what we've fallen back to. It's working for us. You like it or not, you don't want to hear that. It's working for us as we wait for a vaccine, as we wait for things to change. But that's our local knowledge. And apparently they have refused to acknowledge that that really can work. They're saying, oh, we don't understand. What don't you understand? Just ask us, we'll tell you. But unfortunately, you don't believe that we know what you're doing is what is working. So you still want to commission a team of researchers to come here and do some exotic, complicated research to understand how Africa has really pulled through this in a way that nobody expected. So just to cut this short and not to dramatize it so much, there is need to value diversity, and this need to understand that every diversity in the workplace, and that local knowledge is important, and everybody needs to embrace that. And if we are to go far, we should embrace all this and value every participant in the research, in the knowledge production, and even in the knowledge consumption arena. Everybody counts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joy. And that's a really important challenge to all of us, I think, to question all of our assumptions and our biases. And an interesting link to some of the conversation too around digital tools and the way we're also hearing about and seeing the biases that are becoming encoded in those tools, in our algorithms, and in the way knowledge is being curated for us. I think a few of you have been adding comments and questions into the chat, and Chalani, Maha, Joy, if there's anything there you've seen you want to respond to, please jump in. Maha.
I actually wanted to say something related to what I said in the chat in response to Chalani's call, like, what about language? Who else is facing that? I was thinking, like, in Egypt, there's a high illiteracy rate altogether, so that they can't even access any written text. It would have to be video or oral or something. But also going back to education, is the cultural capital at home, is that the assumption of learning from home assumes that parents will help their children much more than was previously the case. And when children learn from home using computers with parents who are completely illiterate, I really don't know how any government believes that this is going to happen, that it's going to be equitable, it's going to be possible. What ended up happening in Egypt, I'm very sorry to say, is that private tutors took money from parents to make the projects for their children rather than to teach them. I mean, it would be okay to pay them to teach them, but they weren't teaching them, they were just doing the work for them. And I'm very, very concerned about the long-term impacts for very young children. And so this issue of language is not just about who can you reach, but also then what happens to that family, you know, not just what information can you get to them, but then what about this 1 or 2 or maybe longer years of people learning from home without support at home for people who can't have that support, or people who, or if there are countries where the parents don't speak the same language as is being taught in school. So it's almost as if they're illiterate, right, in that sense.
Thanks very much. Have either Joy or Chalani anything you want to pick up from the questions that have been posed in the chat box that you've seen? Indeed, does anybody have a question that they'd like to address to the panel and that they haven't done so far?
Unless
a few questions I can see from Enrica. Or some comments about work done in India by the Martha Farah Foundation that was interesting about domestic workers.
I'm not sure I can see any question that is directly related to something that I spoke about, or a question that I can pick up now. Perhaps I want to pass on to Chalani just in case she has something.
I'll comment on the experience shared by Niharika about a study done on domestic workers, where the study was conducted in their language and the community through a participatory approach. I think that's a really excellent example about, I think, any form of research in how we kind of reflect the voice of the community in research. So that sounds like a very, very unique example, but I think in general, finding a way to sort of have stories, case studies, not in a sort of a very kind of token way, as some studies do, but sort of really getting into the issues and the problems faced by different communities. I was just talking to my team today about a new sort of campaign they want to run about the importance of open data in the country. And what they were saying was, we have said it so many times as researchers, and academics have said it, and policymakers have said it, but we want to stop saying it now. We want to stop talking about it and actually reach out to people who suffer from a lack of open data policies in Sri Lanka. So I think that kind of ways to incorporate participatory approaches in research, I think, but definitely sort of bringing in the opinions and actual stories of the community and how they face problems as a result of a lack of implementation in whatever policy or legislation is really important.
Thanks very much. I think that's a really useful addition to your earlier point about not just disseminating knowledge to people in their own languages, but actually involving them in its production, really upending the power relationships there. I haven't seen any more comments or questions coming in the chat. We've got about 10 minutes left. Perhaps one kind of question thought for you all to think about is what we've been talking about involves a need to disturb a lot of asymmetries in power, really challenge who is deciding. And in lots of ways, Maha, you spoke about very senior institutional leaders in universities deciding how teachers are going to teach and what kind of tools they're going to use. Joy, you talked about how funders are controlling what research is done, but also in the process, what methods and what kind of knowledge are valued. What can we do to kind of further unsettle those norms and those systems? And I'm really struck by the fact that so much of this becomes kind of ways of doing things become sort of hardwired into the system, and we can't imagine other ways of doing things because that's the way they've been written into our systems, into our processes. There are ways of doing research. There are ways of assessing a funding application or deciding what's going to be published in a particular venue. What can we do to kind of unsettle those and to really turn it in on us? For example, what as you said, Joy, there's a perception sometimes that it's the North who comes to do the capacity building or to provide the knowledge or whatever that is. What can we do in those roles to really challenge the way we approach these issues? And maybe that's a different role we should be playing. Who wants to come in first?
Maybe I could just make a small comment on that. You see, the starting point is very quickly, what have we learned through COVID? We've learned that, yes, there are inequalities which have been exacerbated, but then now the consequences are much bigger. And do we need to do something about it? Definitely, we should do something about it. First and foremost, the thing is we need to think about metrics that work for us. What measures what is good for us in all spheres? How do we measure what is good for quality? What determines that? What theories do we use? If we use theory which are based on perfect economies with much lesser constraints and all that, how best are they for us? So we should develop metrics that work for us and embrace them. Secondly, when it comes to publishing knowledge, now for how long do we keep being told this is not good? Good to whose standards and good for what? We must decide and shape to know what is it that we need to know and what is good. And what is good actually is really what works in the pragmatic world. What works, minimizing the costs of doing it. It's what works efficiently, regardless of what. There is no point to keep saying that we cannot publish this, is not good enough. So in other words, we need to come up with ways whereby we can be able to generate and distribute knowledge that really works for us. We need to come up with journals, for that matter, which are seen to be good and embrace them as good just because they work for us, not because they work for the West. What's the point of coming up with such a theoretical concrete models that means nothing for a policymaker in my country? And I've used public resources to go to school, yet I'm not able to contribute to my country because I want to please somebody else out there that my work is good. Good for what? I think we need to answer those questions. And again, another thing that I've really seen is that now the collaboration in terms of research, nobody can travel, right? We want to hope that now that a lot of research is happening in developing countries, there's much more relying on local researchers. We want to hope that by the end of it all, we have value the knowledge created by local researchers and keep them as principal researchers from now, and co-researchers and principal investigators, and with equal bargaining or equal contributions to research. We should not be seen as data analysts, data collectors, and just brokers who can speak the local language and do not the paths through the village. No, we want the role that we have crafted for ourselves now as lead researchers, just because you cannot travel. Even if you want to come, you can't come. But I'm here, I can collect the data, they can analyze it, and they can share it. We want to maintain that space forever. So we need to understand and be pragmatic about these things and change this, and actually decolonize knowledge, or to say. I'm sorry if I'm talking to Verité and Yona there, my former colonizers, but yeah, we need to move out of that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joy. Maha or Chalani, any kind of final reflections from you?
Well, first of all, like, very well said, Joy, like everything today, but especially those last points. I actually don't have a lot to add to what you said. I'm just going to give examples. So I agree with you. Like, first of all, we need to recognize that some of us, especially those who have succeeded in academia, may have internalized. So we need to decolonize ourselves and become conscious of the ways in which we are used to setting our standards by Western standards and Northern standards, and we need to shift that into pragmatic and what works for us. And so, for example, what you were saying is, instead of saying, oh, all the funding is coming from the West, can we do it with less funding? Can we manage it in other ways? I mean, if the funding is coming to give us the wrong thing, then I don't want that funding. If it's going to make me lose my soul or make me do something that doesn't really help. And we know a lot of this, no offense, Northern capacity building, they don't bring the best person to come to us. They bring people that know less than us. They pay them money. So the funding actually goes back to the West. It doesn't come to us really. If we just ignore that money and we get our own people to do public scholarship within our own country at a much lower cost, we can do much better work. And we'd be building the capacity locally with people who understand the context, right? And so one example is, instead of asking people to go on the internet and search for things and do everything online, Egypt and a lot of the developing countries have always had educational TV that everyone has access to, that does not require faster connections, that does not require digital literacy, that a lot of people have access to. And a lot of countries did go to that, and there was nothing wrong with it. Just because the internet is an option and is the dominant discourse does not mean that it has to be the one that you use for every single thing. You can do phone calls instead of having to go online. There are a lot of things that are more accessible and just not what we talk about. So it's about asking those different questions and not taking a deficit model of, oh, you don't know enough. No, well, change the standards. Like everything that you said there. What do we really need, and what's the minimum we need, and what's pragmatic right here? And I'm going to tell you something that I did this summer very quickly. Instead of spending my summer writing research papers or researching COVID, which nobody needed me to do that right now, I spent the time developing community building resources as how do you build community online. And I just made very simple homemade videos that cost me nothing except a little bit of my time during my vacation. And I invited a lot of people, and because I know enough people, we did it. And we have over 30 resources now. I'm going to put the link for them online in 2-3 weeks. If I tried to do this with funding and with and like quality standards and, oh, your video is not good enough or your audio is not good enough. We just had someone to do the closed captioning because that's important for accessibility. And we got money for that. But otherwise, you didn't need, you need to think, what do people need right now? How can I do it with the minimum amount of resources possible? Not who can give me funding and how can they control what's important and what's not important for me. So I'm just building on what Joy said, actually. I'd love to hear Chalani's last words. So.
I'll just add one last point to what Joy and Maha said, especially because Joy brought up the point of using metrics. So in Sri Lanka, I was just reflecting on this earlier, sort of information that comes from the West to the country is rejected or accepted based on what kind of information it is. So usually if it's to do with the sciences, medicine, infrastructure, it's accepted. But anything coming from the West to do with sort of human rights or liberal economic policy or sort of feminism, those kinds of discourses are often seen as, they're incorrect, they're coming from the West. So whatever kind of subject or discipline you're dealing with, I think the as researchers, as academics, as think tanks, wherever we stand, one of the main things that we need to do is to focus on sort of data-driven sort of interventions into these debates. A lot of the time, sort of people get lost in these ideologies based on, or sort of it's all based on opinion and not really facts and figures and data at all. So I think one sort of important thing that we should all do in challenging certain asymmetries in knowledge to bring out certain knowledge that is not widely accepted is to use data-driven approach and stay away from sort of opinions that kind of is spread anyway like wildfire every day when you turn on the news. Sort of complementing those sentiments within society with the correct facts, the figures, the metrics, the case studies that you can't hide from is something that I would like to end with. Yes.
Thanks very much. And we've actually just come to our end of our time, which is great because it means that I don't have to try and do the impossible task of offering any intelligent summary here. I think you've all said it perfectly, and I can't add to that anyway. So just a thank you all for taking the time and for a really, really provocative and interesting discussion, challenging in lots of ways. And thanks also to everybody who joined to listen in and added their comments in the chat. This has been recorded, so it will be available somewhere in perpetuity. And we look forward to continuing the conversation in many different ways. Thank you very much.